China remembers everything. Every betrayal, every humiliation, every broken promise. The West, they'd prefer you forget, move on, look to the future. But that memory isn't going anywhere. It's become a weapon, and it's reshaping the entire world order. You know the same trust takes years to build, but seconds to destroy. Now scale that up to an entire nation, an entire civilization. Imagine being humiliated for over a century, carved up by foreign powers, deliberately drugged, controlled, all while those same powers claimed they were civilizing you. Now imagine becoming powerful enough to make absolutely certain it never happens again. That's China's story. That's the fire driving everything they do today. And when Western leaders talk about a rules-based international order, China doesn't hear noble principles. They hear the rules we wrote when you were weak, and they'll never be weak again. Let me take you back to where this all started. China is the wealthiest, most technologically advanced civilization on the planet. They have porcelain that European royalty would kill for, silk that defines luxury, tea that's become an addiction across the West. Europe is desperate to buy Chinese goods. But here's Britain's nightmare. China doesn't want a single thing Britain has to offer. China's perfectly content trading for silver. Just pay in hard currency, and we're good. Problem is, Britain's silver reserves are bleeding out. They're going broke buying tea. So the British Empire comes up with a solution. An evil, calculated, devastating solution. They start flooding China with opium. Not small-time drug dealing. Industrial-scale narcotics trafficking. Grown in British-controlled India. Shipped to China. Sold to anyone with money. The goal: get millions of Chinese people addicted. Then watch as China's silver flows back into British pockets to pay for the drug. It works horrifyingly well. Within decades, millions of Chinese are addicted. The economy starts collapsing. Families are destroyed. Entire communities fall apart. The Chinese government finally says, enough. They appoint an official named Lin Zexu. He's tough, uncompromising. He confiscates over 1,000 tons of opium from British merchants and destroys it all. Dumps it into the ocean. Britain's response? War Angus. Yes. Britain declared war on China because China wouldn't let them poison Chinese citizens for profit. This becomes the first opium war. And it's not even close. China has more soldiers, but Britain has steamships, modern cannons, rifles that reload in seconds. Chinese forces are still using outdated weapons and traditional tactics. Britain crushes them. China is forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. It's a disaster. China has to pay massive compensation, open ports to British trade, and hand over Hong Kong forever. But here's what makes this so much worse. Once Britain proved China could be beaten, that this ancient empire could be forced to sign treaties at gunpoint every other Western power wanted in. France, Germany, Russia, Japan, even the United States. They all lined up between 1842 and 19. China was forced to sign what historians call the Unequal Treaties. These weren't negotiations between equals. These were documents signed with warships anchored off your coast and cannons pointed at your cities. Each treaty stripped away more sovereignty, more territory, more dignity. The Second Opium War, from 1856 to 1860, was even more vicious. British and French forces marched inland. They reached Beijing, and they found the old summer palace. This place had taken 150 years to build. It was filled with irreplaceable cultural treasures, art spanning dynasties, ancient texts, objects of unimaginable beauty, representing the pinnacle of Chinese civilization. The British and French forces looted everything they could carry. Then they set it on fire. The palace burned for 3 days straight. Why? No military reason. Just to send a message. Just to humiliate. Just to show China that even their most sacred places meant nothing. Imagine foreign armies burning the Louvre or torching the British Museum. That's what this was to China. By the late 1800s, China had been carved into what Western powers politely called spheres of influence. Britain controlled parts. France controlled parts. Germany, Russia, Japan. Everyone grabbed a piece. For 2,000 years, China had been the center of civilization, the most advanced culture on Earth. Then in just a few decades, they became a playground for foreign empires. Chinese resources extracted. Chinese labor exploited. Chinese people treated like second-class citizens in their own country. In some treaty ports, there were literally signs that read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed. In China. Let that image sit with you for a moment. By 1900, the Chinese people had had enough. The Boxer Rebellion erupted. Ordinary Chinese citizens rose up against foreign domination. They attacked foreigners, burned churches, tried desperately to reclaim their country. The response: 8 foreign nations: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, and Austria-Hungary formed an alliance just to crush this rebellion. They sent a combined military force, crushed the uprising, occupied Beijing again. Then they forced China to pay 450 million taels of silver in reparations. Think about that. China had to pay billions for the crime of trying to expel the people exploiting them. This entire nightmare from 1839 to 1949 is what China calls the Century of Humiliation. And here's what you need to understand. This isn't distant history that Chinese people vaguely learned about once in school. This is core curriculum, taught every single year. It's in movies, television shows. There are museums with permanent exhibitions dedicated entirely to this period. Every Chinese citizen grows up knowing this story. It's part of national identity. When Chinese leaders talk about national rejuvenation or the Chinese dream, they're not speaking in abstractions. They mean never that weak again, never that humiliated again, never let foreigners dictate our fate again. The Communist Party's entire claim to legitimacy rests on one historical fact: we ended the humiliation. When Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square on October 1st, 1949, and declared the Chinese people have stood up, he wasn't just making a speech. He was responding directly to a century of being forced to kneel. They mean never that weak again, never that humiliated again, never let foreigners dictate our fate again. The Communist Party's entire claim to legitimacy rests on one historical fact: we ended the humiliation. When Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square on October 1st, 1949, and declared the Chinese people have stood up, he wasn't just making a speech. He was responding directly to a century of being forced to kneel. So, China finally breaks free in 1949. They're independent, ready to rebuild. Does the West welcome them as equals? Not remotely. During the Cold War, the United States and its allies tried everything to isolate China. Complete trade embargo. China couldn't join the United Nations for over 20 years. Taiwan held the seat, instead representing China despite controlling only a small island. The United States built military alliances, completely surrounding China's borders. Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Taiwan, Thailand. The message was unmistakable: we will never accept you as an equal power. Then came the Korean War, 1952-1953. Chinese and American soldiers fought each other directly. Over 180,000 Chinese troops died. From Beijing's perspective, American forces were right in their border, threatening their security all over again. Then Vietnam. The United States fought a brutal war in China's backyard, partially to contain Chinese communist influence. Even when China began opening up economically in the 1970s, under Deng Xiaoping, the relationship was transactional, strategic, never based on trust. Fast forward to recent decades, China does everything the West says they should do. They open their economy, welcome foreign investment, joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. They think, okay, we're playing by the rules now. We're a part of the system. But from China's view, the goalposts keep moving. Take technology. For decades, Western companies were thrilled to do business in China. Outsource manufacturing, pay low wages, access that massive consumer market. Everything was great. Then, China started developing its own technology companies, Huawei, ZTE, TikTok, companies that could actually compete with Western firms. Suddenly, national security concerns, bans, sanctions, export restrictions. The United States banned Huawei from 5G networks and pressured allies worldwide to do the same. Now, maybe those security concerns are legitimate, maybe they're not. But here's how China sees it. When we major cheap products, no problem. The moment we compete at the cutting edge, we're suddenly a threat. Or look at the South China Sea. Yes, China has territorial disputes there. But from their perspective, look at the military situation. The United States has bases in Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Guam and Singapore. American aircraft carriers regularly patrol waters that are literally on the other side of the planet from America but right next to China. Can you imagine the American reaction if Chinese warships constantly patrolled the Gulf of Mexico? Or the Caribbean? There'd be outrage, talk of aggression, threats of retaliation. But American ships near China, that's just maintaining freedom of navigation. Then there's the China threat narrative that dominates Western media. Every few years, a new angle. China's stealing our jobs. China's stealing technology. China's committing human rights violations. China's engaging in debt trap diplomacy. China's preparing for war. Some of these criticisms have merit, some don't, but China sees a pattern. No matter what they do, the West finds reasons to contain them. Reform your economy? Not enough. Open up, trade, but yorre, cheating. Build infrastructure abroad, debt trap, develop technology, national security threat. Here's a moment that gets completely overlooked in the West but remains seared into Chinese memory. NATO is bombing Yugoslavia. The United States is leading the campaign. American bombs hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Journalists killed, 20 others wounded. The US military says it was an accident. Song, outdated maps, didn't mean to hit the embassy. But consider what China sees. NATO, led by America, is bombing a sovereign country without UN Security Council approval. They hit a diplomatic embassy which under international law is supposed to be absolutely sacrosanct, untouchable. And the explanation is, oops, we had the wrong map. Whether it was truly an accident or not doesn't really matter for how it's perceived. The message China received loud and clear. International law applies when it's convenient for the West. Sovereignty is respected when it suits their interests. And Chinese lives. Collateral damage. Mistakes happen. Thousands of Chinese students protested outside Western embassies across China. The government lodged furious complaints. But the deeper lesson reinforced what China already believed. The West operates on power, not principles. So where does that leave us today? China is strong now. Second largest economy in the world, projected to become first within years. Advanced technology, powerful military, growing influence across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and they remember absolutely everything. When Western leaders talk about the rules-based international order, China hears, the order you created when we were weak. When they talk about free trade, China hears, free when it benefits you, restricted when we become competitive. When they talk about human rights, China hears, a political weapon you deploy against us while ignoring violations by your allies. Is this interpretation fair? That's debatable. But fair or not, this is the lens through which China views the world. And it's a lens ground and polished by 180 years of bitter experience of every aspect of Chinese foreign policy today makes sense only when you understand this historical trauma. The massive military build-up, never be vulnerable to foreign invasion again. The push for technological independence, never let others control. Critical infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative, build alternative trade routes. The West can't blockade. The refusal to compromise on Taiwan. Reunification represents erasing the last territorial humiliation. The South China Sea fortifications. Controlled waters foreigners once used to invade. All of it traces back to one core conviction: never again. This is why everyone should care about this history. China isn't going anywhere. They're not going to collapse economically. They're not going to become a Western-style democracy. And they're absolutely not going to forget what happened. The West and China are locked in a competition that's fundamentally shaped by deep historical mistrust. Every trade dispute, every technology restriction, every military build-up, every alliance formation, it all connects back to this history that can trust ever be rebuilt between China and the West. Honestly, it's hard to imagine how that trust requires vulnerability. China learned that vulnerability leads to exploitation. That trust requires letting go of the past. But China has made remembering the past central to national identity. Does this mean war is inevitable? No. Countries that deeply mistrust each other can still coexist, trade, even cooperate on shared challenges like climate change or pandemics. But it means we're entering an era where the global order will be fundamentally contested, where China builds parallel international institutions because they don't trust Western-led ones, where every diplomatic interaction happens through layers of historical grievance and suspicion, where both sides view the other's actions through the worst possible lens The Century of Humiliation officially ended in 1949 when the Communist Party took power. But its shadow stretches across the entire 21st century and beyond. China remembers every broken treaty, every burned palace, every unequal agreement forced at gunpoint. And that memory isn't just history. It's policy now. It's strategy. It's the foundation of how China engages with the world. The dragon was humiliated. The dragon rebuilt itself, and the dragon will never, ever forget. If this story revealed why China sees the world the way it does, hit that like button and subscribe to Axis Lens. We uncovered the history that actually explains the present. Want to understand how this century of humiliation started with Britain's opium trade? That story is already waiting for you.